Hi, pleasure everybody coming in. Welcome to my short little presentation on synthesizing the band gap between green and yellow. So kind of we are trying to together now achieve some form of like general understanding of what I want to try to explain here. So we're gonna be looking in the beginning about a bit of semantics, what I actually try or like mean with these different terms, and then we go into a bit more detail of what actually can be done, right? Okay, so let's begin uh, with the term I used is that is band gap. I use this from physics, which is basically the idea that especially valence electrons require a certain amount of energy to do stuff, basically. And so there is this quote unquote band gap that has to be moved over. So a certain amount of energy is required so that the electron actually jumps and actually can do stuff. And so in my opinion, this is something that we can kind of observe right now. There is kind of a sort of energy missing, a kind of developmental energy, if you want to call it, that is required to actually jump to the next stage. And that also goes to the next term, which is synthesizing, which goes along in also many scientific traditions, which is like, well, let's make an idea really concrete and actually like extract all the like extra stuff, like withdraw that from the actual stuff that you want to produce, right? Like synthesizing, I don't know, like a polymer or something in chemistry. You just want to build that singular polymer um, in all its gloryfulness, right? Like totally reproduce it, like infinitely scalable. And that's what we are trying to do here as well. And so let's define the two other words, especially for people who are not that familiar with, especially Graves and spiral dynamics and Ken Wilber's work. And that's the green value meme. So yeah, which is a more relativist kind of moral ethos that allows especially a more holistic group thinking in the form of like group social dynamics. And yellow, which is also usually called like the first tier two step, allows a more kind of holistic approach to the general kind of moralistic framework that usually undergirds how we deal with stuff in society, right? So I threw in some terms there like knowledge, complexity, sustainability, and integration. All of these things in itself have to kind of manifest within the green value meme. So yeah, that we actually achieve some form of next generation of understanding of this world. And to really break this down, I want to take it a bit more in the idea of Ken Wilber and especially the four quadrants, so we can actually look with a bit more granular detail what is actually happening with these stages, right? Because what interests us is stuff that specifically the different stages care about, what the different stages particularly focus about, and where we actually have angles to actually tune them, or where we have actually some form of actionable stuff to show or like kind of like show the incompleteness of the different stages. But I'm getting ahead of myself because what's really interesting usually about probably any topic ever is that like the tails matter, right? So the most in like extreme circumstances of anything are usually where the magic happens, right? It's which is either the super lower bound or the super higher bound of any system, right? The mean usually does not have any action at all. If you're sitting in the mean, you're comfortable, you're stable, you don't actually need to adapt in any way, shape, or form. If you're really like if your circumstances are really terrible, then you have a lot of force to actually do stuff. And if you're really strong, then you can do stuff out of your strength, right? Like you have power to do stuff. And so in psychology specifically, we call this thing Leidensdruck, right? You can be depressed, you can feel absolutely morbid and extremely existentially anxious, but that gives you a lot of adaptive capacity, right? Like if I'm in constant pain and in constant suffering, there is actually a reason for me to adapt. It actually gives me possibility and angles to talk to my ego like to combat certain restrictions I have in my own psyche, which without this amount of suffering, I wouldn't actually have the capacity to change stuff that is usually quite restricted emotionally. And so the other thing I just talked about, which is the strength part, is kind of the ascension, right? So I have completely conquered something, and through this strength and like through like searching what is more, like what more can I do? Like, I've just completely become kind of the Übermensch, if you want to call it. Like, I've killed the god of my existence. I've completely conquered and slain it. What is more to do, right? And so you have to face a new god, which is the kind of ascension. I manifest a new kind of deity that I can follow. Okay, so I kind of teased it. What we are interested in is the incompleteness of any world system, right? So any stage has to deal with incompleteness. And this is kind of where the ruptures take place, right? Where you can't really deal anymore with the certain circumstances that you observe. And I'm going into a bit more detail now. And I think one observable that's quite evident, especially in regards to the stages, is that they usually don't really care about one of the four quadrants. They kind of ignore it in a weird way. And they usually have one modus operandi and like one collapse and one ascension stage of the four quadrants, right? Where like they really operate in a single mode. For example, in the modernist, like in the orange part of existence, the upper right, the id, it's really something that they care about, right? Like material wealth, like what scientifically can you prove in this existence? And what really lacks is the kind of ego, because that's what kind of collapses, right? Like it shows your own insignificance in a weird way, right? Like your ego is unimportant in comparison to the objective world. But what they're actually building, and that's the ascension part of the orange existence, is very robust modernistic institutions. We would call this democracy or some form of representative parliamentarian systems that through certain different mechanics can have representative frameworks that allow much higher levels of coordination than was previously possible, right? And along comes Green, and Green basically says, well, the kind of material sense collapses, right? We only have that many resources to extract. We cannot go complete ballooning in a weird way. And so what we really care about is let's build social and environmental systems, right? Like a governance that allows us to kind of mitigate some of these issues that are being caused by extreme levels of material searchings and aspiring. But what they're actually doing, and that's the kind of lower left part of it, the we aspect, is actually building social systems that allow for that, right? I think one of these observables is, for example, effective altruism, right? Because they have kind of started to create a kind of like gauged value system of how we actually can interact with one another through a very utilitarian lens. Because ultimately, you always have to judge all members of the system and actually have like a foundation on which you can judge, because otherwise it's just a completely hollow construction. It needs a stable foundation from which you like actually can be elevated and look downwards to make like understandable judgment and actually climbable judgment. I think that's also the important part, right? The stairs have to be created. There has to be some form of ladder that shows you the progress, how it actually got there. And now comes yellow. And yellow's big deal is usually the collapse of the lower right, right? So we've got systems of environments, we've got especially institutions that collapse like in their usefulness, right? We cannot deal with Moloch in democratic institutions because the capture of these systems is so strong that collective sense making itself gets ruptured, and therefore kind of the modus operandi is like, how do we find a new we that we can deal with, right? Like, what are social systems that create like harmonic in coexistence, and how can we all be happy with one another and get along? But what it actually does in that sense is actually ego development, right? It massively increases the resilience of the I so that I can actually withdraw myself from all these very addicting information gathering machines of social media and whatever, right? That truly captures the self, the own consciousness, and completely like saturates it. And that manifests through like meditation practices and so on and so forth. And I'm going to go into a bit more into the future because I think that's also important, as it's really tricky usually to see like the extent where you can push an ideology to actually see where you then have to let go and actually make the new step. And therefore, also looking at turquoise and trying to understand where whatever system I'm proposing here now will actually collapse, and that's the we function, right? Turquoise understands in a weird intersubjective way that the we aspect can be extremely menacing as well, because it can be extremely oppressive, right? Like if you just have cultural values that are dictated from the top up, this gives no fluidity in the system, right? There's just nothing that's gonna stop the onslaught of the majority from like figuratively killing people. And so what it's actually much more interested in is actually having an adequate gauge of the upper right. That's the ascension part, right? Through extreme level of ego development, of the I development, we can actually achieve, without super restrictive measures, material coordination that's otherwise not really possible. So one of the best examples of that is probably Daniel Schmachtenberger, who's quite obvious, at least turquoise, because he understands that whatever system we are building, it has to be gauged in some form of materialistic layer that has to be individually from an I perspective understood. And an example there, for example, is the idea of, well, anybody can make a steak with like with some form of like Bunsen burner or some form of like grill in the garden. But you can't really police that because that would require a police state. So the only way around this is if there's awareness of the I, of how collapsing that is if everybody does that, right? So the I has to refrain from using like cultural norms. So the modus operandi is the ego development, but the ascension part is the like how do we deal with the material. And so that goes a long way, right? The unionist stage is kind of, well, upper left, the ego has its limitations, and we are in this uber consciousness of like complete collectivization. And ultimately, whatever I do in a supreme ego death is basically meaningless along the entire existence and the entire reality. And I'm not going to go into much detail there because I'm not aware of it. And so, yeah, let's get back into the incompleteness because, as I just mentioned, especially about yellow, is, and because I talked about beforehand about the tails, is the collapse function and the ascension function, right? So we should really try and identify those two because that gives us an angle of what is actually interesting, and especially modus operandi, right? The general quadrant that these people are usually in, that yellow people are usually in, and feel that they can express themselves. And because in green, right, obviously what they are developing is a we function. So there we have our two issues, right? Like how do we move green? It's either through showing the kind of collapse of the modus operandi of green, which is the lower right, right? Like showing the collapse of social systems, of why they're incompetent in a weird way, and giving them opportunity to ascend truly, right? Like making the we part of the modus operandi, right? Like what they actually want to spend time with. So, for example, many people here in these sort of liminal and spiral dynamics spaces really try to occupy their time with the we function. Like we want to be social, we want to have gatherings, we want to express ourselves within social settings. That's amazing. Like that feels like a yellow spirit that has taken hold. That has become the primary motivator for existence. That's the modus operandi of the quadrant. And so let's get a bit more in the like collapse part because I want to start there and then end on a positive note. Um, and we can see this quite evidently in very different stages of like our ages, because one of these collapse functions is the baby building a sandcastle and it collapses because it doesn't understand like structural integrity, right? As a baby, I have wishes and I want to place them into this world, right? Like I want to have food, I want to have social time with a mother or whatever, right? And so if I first start building a sandcastle, it's probably going to collapse because what's judging me is the like abstract objective world. And whatever wish I'm going to place, there is not going to be any form of me wishing something that actually makes my structure per se more resistant to collapse, right? And no matter how hard I try, no matter how much I express my dissatisfaction with it, the completely empathyless world of the objective does not care. And so that creates Leidensdruck for the child, for the baby, to understand that there is something as the objective, something that doesn't care, has zero empathy. And if you remember right now, especially in regards to the system, that creates an angle for us, right? Like we have to find, hopefully, a sort of game that simulates the collapse function of the specific quadrant. Okay? Much like a baby is building a sandcastle and it ruptures, implodes, whatever, because of it's not because it's not capable of understanding the material, their objective world. We can try and build something that creates, if we remember, that destroys the lower right, the modus operandi of the green. And so usually how that manifests is some form of group exclusion. And that happens because the ideals that green places into this world does not have adequate amount of institutional backing to actually follow through these things. How to say that, right? Like if you have a really strong individual, as an example, that constantly pushes the group norms and what is actually acceptable in a really honest way, in an honest, ironic way, he will sooner or later reach a point where this becomes annoying to the majority of the group. But the group itself does not have any system of explaining or showing or dealing with that level of push and like kind of moving the goalpost in a weird way, right? It just feels uncomfortable to them. And so what usually most groups then do is some form of exclusion. They're saying, well, whatever kind of implicit moral value here we have, you kind of break that. And so we can't have you here because you're pushing too hard. Like you're actively challenging many people here, and we can't have that, even though they can't norm it, right? Like they cannot gauge it in some form of like like abstract explanation, right? Like for example, we want to be like a social gang that has a lot of empathy, and we don't really care about like huge debate climate because we want to have people, if they leave from here, especially in the evening, want to feel happy, right? And it doesn't really go into much detail, right? Like, yeah, we just want to have people that feel satisfied and happy. And there is a lack of a proper explanation of what they actually crave and what they're actually seeking. And so that's the incompleteness, right? There is an ascension of like, we want to feel happy as a group, but it's not actually, it doesn't actually have a foundation. And that leads to exclusion. And one of these games, which always pops into my head in that instance, is something in German would call Werwolf, or in English, it's usually called Mafia, which is a form of social game where you actually kind of play with that dynamic, right? You have a group of people that is per se social, but you have group dynamics that allows you to exploit these sort of majority dynamics, right? Because, well, I can be mafia, but I have to kind of hide that I'm mafia and asking poignant questions or like say stuff in a way that allows others to maybe suspect someone else and charge people in a way. And this kind of teaches you the implicit kind of game dynamics or game theoretic dynamics that goes along with having different objectives for different agents, right? Like I, for example, as a normal civilian within a mafia game, have the objective to win and survive. And there are a couple of angles that I can take, but after playing long enough, a kind of a pattern emerges how you actually deal with that. Because I have to say a bit because information sharing usually leads to a better outcome for everybody, but I can't say too much because that would seem threatening and a bit dangerous because that would mean that I would become like a singular individual. And so there's a kind of wave that you can ride of enough information sharing without oversharing, right? Because then it becomes kind of fake. And so that of kind of is a spirit of a game that actually shows this kind of very explicit wave riding or the band gap, if we want, between green and yellow in a game setting. And that is amazing. So I'd highly encourage any young person to play this game, especially like rigorously playing it with a lot of people that you know, because you really explore yourself. And another option, and I've said it a couple of times, even in these circles here, is like a sort of gamifying of government institutions in a weird way, because it lets you explore much deeper multivariant opinion polls or multivariant opinions and agendas in a game theoretic setting, right? Because that allows you in a different way, under a lot of pressure and a lot of stress, again, Leidensdruck, right? To achieve multi-perspectival consequences of actions. So if I have interest and you have interest, and there are like 5, 6, 7 more interests, that means I have to make matrices of values and compare them and kind of gauge them in a field of equilibriums where they can be kind of stable. That's a yellow ability, right? Like the MHC metasystematic stage says that you have like a kind of matrices level of understanding of logical imperatives and logical coordinations. That's something that you can learn playfully, just from a pure intellectual stance, right? I have to talk to people. I have to show cooperation. I have to show an ability to be able to share information to an adequate amount. I have to be able to negotiate. And if I'm not able to do that from a very universalistic value, because I have to deal with uncertainties, then I'm just going to lose. And if I lose really hard, like for example, I do war or some kind of restrictive action that kind of undermines my negotiation position, I'm going to get excluded. And that is extremely menacing because being excluded from a negotiation, especially in a multi-party system, multi-party negotiation, always leads to the worst outcome. Always. But I told about the second option, and that's ascension. And I'm not too sure yet what that actually means for the yellow stage to like the super specific degree. But having heard some information, especially from the Hansi guys, it seems to me quite obvious that some form of meta teaming is probably the way forward, right? So truly making the modus operandi, as I said before, of the yellow stage, the we aspect like a ritual or some form of like practice that you do rigorously each time and each day in a very collaborative small circle of people where you do like collaborative meditating in a weird way, in a kind of collaboration aspect, that seems to be a way to like truly aspire to yellow through just a practical sense, like through a practice sense. Very much like there are different ways of achieving enlightenment in through yoga, right? Through the Hinduistic and Buddhistic traditions. That's certainly one angle. And I'd also claim that there is a second angle from a pure strength perspective, and that's just through passive osmosis and role models. Because the ego is a very competitive spirit, and you can kind of achieve a certain level of enlightenment if you just watch people that are significantly intellectually more capable than you are. And that certainly, in my development, helped me a lot because if people can show you logical coordinations and logical effects that you are yourself not capable of achieving by your own thoughts, and you kind of feel that you're incapable, that also gives like a skill check or a reality check to the ego that allows you to kind of, I don't want to call it breaking it, but again, showing the incompleteness of your own thought system. And so I thank you. This was like a short introduction. I'm going to have a second talk about this topic, and I'm going to go into a bit more detail of how these options that I just showed can actually be somewhat proven, even somewhat mathematically. And yeah, I'm going to open this now for a bit more of a dialogue. Thank you for your attention.